Hello and welcome to Give Yourself Some Leeway, the brand new podcast for high achievers with me, Eugene Lee. Join me as I talk about all things from dealing with work-related stress, burnout, and reinforcing your physical, mental and emotional well-being for a more sustainable and enjoyable work-life balance. I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and if you do, please hit like and subscribe. So let's move on to what we'll be covering in this episode. So over the next few episodes, I'll be talking about the life-changing lessons that I've learned from my experience recovering from burnout and the unexpected journey it took me on. Now, I've learned an awful lot about burnout and about myself over these last few years on my burnout journey. For those of you new to my content, I initially burnt out back in 2019 with the onset of symptoms as far back as 2014, which should give you an idea of how early on you could identify symptoms of burnout to prevent it in the first place. But we'll get to that later on. So on this journey and the whole burnout recovery process, I've learned an awful lot about what burnout really is, what it means, how to recover, and I've also learned, amongst other things, just how isolating and alone it feels to go through the burnout recovery process. Yes, it can be raw, it can be uncomfortable, and it can make you question some of your core beliefs. But part of that process opens your mind and awareness to areas of your life where you probably didn't realize you were depriving yourself and those around you. So the aim of today's podcast is to share some of the things that I've learned in the hope that perhaps some of you might listen to this and recognize the symptoms within yourself and be able to do something about it. Or equally, some of you listening to this might find it helpful and avoid slipping into burnout in the first place. So if any of these things are achieved, then my work here is done. So let's get started with the first lesson I learned about burnout, which is what burnout is. This might sound silly or strange, but honestly, when it all started, I had no idea what was happening to me. I didn't know that it was a thing, that there was a name for it. I just tried alleviating the symptoms and not addressing the real issue until I reached a crisis point, by which it was too late. So it was only once I started my recovery journey, when I looked back with a bit of hindsight and, did a bit of research, other than, writing your symptoms to good old Dr. Google, that was when I discovered that this was actually called burnout. What I was experiencing had a name. It had a definition. And, that there wasn't something horribly wrong with me. Because at this point, I had assumed that everything was down to me, that it was down to my poor life and health choices that I've made over the years, my own failings. And I didn't realize that it wasn't my fault. So the WHO definition of burnout states that it is an occupational phenomenon which occurs after a state of prolonged workplace stress. And it comprises of three components. 1, depersonalization, the depletion of caring, empathy, and compassion. 2, emotional exhaustion, the fatigue of caring far too much for too long. And 3, a decreased sense of accomplishment and reduced professional efficacy. And this usually comes along with a sense of futility, that anything you do doesn't seem to make any difference. So that's the official definition of burnout. But what does it actually feel like? What does it look like, to experience symptoms? So my personal experience was like a slow downward spiral into several symptoms until it got to a point where it was too late to prevent it. So first I'll cover what it looked like from an outside perspective. As I was borderline from burning out, I was more closed off, detached, kind of distancing myself from friends and family. I mean, I still showed up to work and events and gatherings, but friends started to ask, was I really feeling okay? I seemed to be miles away mid-conversation. I sighed and procrastinated over small things like brushing the floor or household chores. And now, I know people might feel like, hang on, nearly everyone feels like, procrastinating on their household chores. And, that's normal from time to time. But I guess it was more of the groaning and huffing and puffing attitude towards like menial tasks like that. And it just, portrayed a very negative attitude towards such trivial matters. And it just wasn't really like me. I would bring work home with me. Well, not physically, but my mind would still be in work mode, worrying about something that was no longer within my control, and I was just unable to switch off. I wasn't able to enjoy spending time relaxing. I was restless, and I was considered a workaholic by my friends, family, colleagues. If I wasn't at work, I was preparing myself for the next working day, or I was waking up 2 hours before a 12-hour shift to make time for writing essays and doing project work for university courses, which I was studying outside of work. Eugene did not have an off switch. What it felt like on the inside, it felt like something etched into like the back cover of a Quentin Tarantino movie script. I'll cover the physical symptoms first, and then I'll touch on the mental and emotional side. And why I like to emphasize the physical symptoms is because they played a huge part of my burnout. So one of the biggest symptoms that I struggled with the most was extreme and completely disproportionate fatigue. No matter how much I slept, I felt sluggish and drained. Some days by mid-morning, others by late afternoon, and some days I'd be extremely focused all day, but I'd still be anticipating whether a slump would hit me that day. It was like I was paranoid that my body was going to betray me, and I was going to slump during an activity where I needed my concentration and efforts the most. I would get daily headaches, and as it got closer to my crisis point, I had it was like a sensation, like a tightening of the airway. Not so much choking, but almost like a hand squeezing the sides of the neck. So it was like harder to speak or sing. And like at the time, singing was one of the biggest outlets for me. So it was really distressing. It really took a knock to my confidence and really took a toll on my self-esteem, trying to cope with what felt like my body was shutting down, but there were no real medically diagnosable symptoms. And at the absolute height of my burnout, I started to develop panic attacks and was hyperventilating at work. And this really was a turning point for me because I had never experienced this before. I honestly thought my body was shutting down at 27 years old. This was my cue that I really needed to get professional help with this. So now that we've covered the physical symptoms and how it looked to my family, friends and work colleagues, let's go over where my head was at, mentally and emotionally. Now, if I could sum this up in a PG-friendly word, it would have to be chaos. I went from being outgoing and optimistic to almost completely numb about everything. I would feel detached from whatever situation was happening to me, positive or negative, like pure emotional exhaustion. Then, out of this numbness, I would get outbursts of overwhelming anxiety. It could happen while driving to work in the morning, halfway through my day, or even at 2 a.m. for no rhyme or reason to explain it. And on top of these random bouts of anxiety, I experienced intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts are thoughts that just pop into your head that you can't control. They might be completely out of context and they can be very distressing. So, for example, I could be walking along the road and see a bus coming and just have a vision of it mounting the footpath and clearing 20 people waiting at the bus stop. And it's not a thought that I want to have, which makes it really disturbing and distressing. Like, it's not like I could control these thoughts. I both cared too much and didn't care enough at work and outside of work. On one hand, I would feel completely demotivated and numb, devoid of any drive to complete my work or my projects and just go through the motions. While on the other hand, I could feel so overwhelmed about the responsibility of it all that I would just want to walk away from it and just never look back. And these would be fleeting emotions, and I would look back on these thoughts and worry about why I had them to begin with. I had no enjoyment at work, in my personal life. I just felt like I was mindlessly going through the motions of it all. Now, this all started about 6 months into my 12-hour working shifts and took about 5 years to develop into full-blown burnout, with the 6 months prior being the most evident of these physical symptoms from an outside perspective. By the end of it, I didn't recognize who I was or what I'd become. I just felt like an imposter in my own skin. And I hadn't had a mental health problem up until that point. I mean, I was studying for 2 diplomas in completely different fields of study, simultaneously while working 48-hour work schedule. And I still didn't struggle with stress as much as I did in that time period. It started as something that was related to my work, but ultimately became more pervasive and affected all areas of my life. However, I will admit that I was very lucky that I didn't experience any suicidal thoughts at this time. I realised that I needed to seek the help that I never looked for before. And I understand that these are not all the symptoms associated with burnout, but just what I experienced myself. Now, I know this first episode is very raw and it can be uncomfortable to some. But you never know who may need to hear this. A lot of us are struggling in our jobs. And that's why I started this group, why I started Leeway. It's to open up a space for discussion. I want to help break down the stigma that's associated with mental health problems in our workplaces, especially amongst high achievers, as we are much more likely to perceive our stress and burnout as a reflection of ourselves, of our own failures. And I want to remind you that it's not your fault. I want you to know that you can get better and that better days are coming. Well, I hope you liked this episode and I hope you found it helpful. And if you did, subscribe to the show, because it makes sure that you don't miss out on new episodes. And it also helps me because it increases the rankings of the show a little bit, which of course makes it a little more easily found by other people who may like it just as much as you. And if you didn't like this episode or anything about the show in general, or if you have any ideas or suggestions or just feedback that you want to share, shoot me an email, eugene@leeway.ie, and let me know what I could do better, or just what your thoughts are on what you'd like to see me do in the future. I read everything myself. I'm always looking for new ideas and constructive feedback. So thanks again for listening to this episode, and I hope to hear from you soon.